Welcome or welcome back, everyone, to another exciting episode of Aaron's Opinion, the podcast for blind people, where we speak about critical issues in the blindness community and all other issues from across the universe and galaxy. Today, boy, we got a treat for you today. Jeremy Opperman has agreed to join us for a double header, 2-hour special today. This is really an honor and a really special thing. Hour number one. Hey, let's talk about history. So, Jeremy, welcome back to Aaron's Opinion. Dig into the conversation. So what is a historical topic and your whole love for history and culture? Why don't you just dive into the history book wherever you want to? I will certainly engage you as you work through the historical topic. We'll talk about this for an hour. First hour, part one, history, go.
Thank you, Aaron. Yeah, it's good to be back. It's good to be back. Yeah, history, I don't know when it started. I think probably where it started was that I come from a family of storytellers. My father and mother were both great storytellers in the sense of engaging us as children with stories about their lives. Um, I'm a little older than you, and so that means that my parents were in quite an exciting time. My mother and father grew up in the 20s um, in South Africa and in Namibia, which wasn't called Namibia in those days. It was called Southwest Africa. My mother grew up there. My father grew up here in South Africa. And his father was born during what is known as the Anglo-Boer War. Um, and his mother, in fact, was born just before the Boer War and remembers her uncles going to war. And so we were brought up with very rich storytelling. My mother, for instance, grew up, her first 6, 7 years of her life were in what is now essentially a ghost town. And it's called Kolmanskop, which means Coleman. Coleman is a name. It's actually named after a man called Coleman. And Kop it means head, but it means a little hill. And for some reason, diamonds were discovered there, alluvial diamonds. And the Germans, who had a colonial conquest of Southwest Africa, um, discovered these diamonds, and of course they flocked in. And it was very much like one of the silver or gold rush towns in Nevada and California that you are so familiar with. And so it was for diamonds. And her father came to South Africa. He was in the First World War, fighting on the German side, survived, obviously. They came after the Weimar Republic in Germany collapsed, and he jumped on a ship to come to Southwest Africa where there was opportunity. So it's very pioneering type times. And so my mother, born in 1926, literally had her first 6 years until the town ran out of diamonds, literally. And so she remembers and brought us up with stories of diamond discovery and diamond finding and the characters that existed. And today, to this day, you can travel to what is now Namibia, and and you go to a town called Luderitz, and you take a right, and you travel for 20 miles, and there you will discover this ghost town, which the dunes have now partially occupied. The dunes have quite literally um, begun to take over, or have in fact taken over several of the buildings. There have been attempts at reclamation and at holding the dunes back, but the building quality was so good that those buildings still 120 years after having been built are still perfectly in good order. So those are so I grew up with this kind of storytelling. And I must tell you another interesting thing was in those days in the 70s, there was you're familiar with the concept of comics. Now, I had low vision. So I was able, using a magnifying glass very often, to read the words. I had to use a magnifying glass, but I was very fond of a comic known as oh heavens, I've forgotten it. The illustrated classic comic. And so illustrated classic comic. And it was wonderful. There were comics, but they were all the classics you cared to name. And they were illustrated, very colorful, beautifully drawn pictures. And the text was at the bottom of each frame, I seem to recall. And with the magnifying glass, I could read that, or my brother would read them to me. But I remember the pictures. I could perceive the pictures. And so at a very early age, I mean, I was literally 5, 6, 7. I was beginning to have a working knowledge of many of the world's classics because of these wonderful illustrated comic books. Just as a segue, there is a very sad fact that intellectuals, academic education intellectuals, thought that these kind of comics were bad for children, and the assumption was that they wouldn't read if they were subjected to these comics. In my opinion, that is patent nonsense. And so they withdrew them. And to this day, you cannot find illustrated classic comics, I don't believe. And so, luckily, we had a whole bunch of them that my father had bought for my older brothers. And so at first they read them to me. And so, I was read to or started reading classics. And so at a very young age, I had a working knowledge of Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer, and the Red Badge of Courage, and several other Mark Twains, and Helen Keller, and hundreds, of comics, and many of them were of actual historical facts and historical accounts. Many of them were historical novels, all of the Jules Verne. So before I was 10, I had a working knowledge of every single Jules Verne. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Journey to the Center of the Earth, Journey to the Moon, Michel Strogoff. And I have a very good memory, and I can still, to this day, remember and picture some of the pictures from those classic comics. And what they did was, it wasn't long before I wanted to read them because I realized that they were abridged. And it wasn't long, but by then I was older, 10, 12, 13 onwards, and started reading the originals, the unabridged. And so that nonsense about children not actually going to read when they subjected to a comic is so unfortunately destructive. I'd like to hang those guys up by their toes because I think they probably did more damage withdrawing those things. Anyway, so that was my introduction to reading. And I think my love of history comes from my love of reading. And I attribute my love of reading to those very comics. And so it wasn't long before I was reading books. Now, I could only read in what was called large print in those days. And the only time you could find large print books, you would go to your local library and you would pretty much have to read what they had on shelf. And so, you couldn't always read what you wanted to read. And so I found myself reading, or my reading list was quite eclectic. And so I was reading things that might have been too advanced for me, or it might have been perhaps not appropriate, not so much appropriate, but not necessarily what a youngster might want to read. But what it did was it gave me a love of reading. And I had a father my father was, apart from being a great storyteller, he was extremely well read. And so it seemed to me as a child that this man, there wasn't a book he hadn't read. And he had a real passion. He had a particular stance. He had read many, 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 many fictional books in his life. And then something happened that made him want to only read non-fiction. And so I was brought up with this man. I don't believe, and I'm not kidding, I do not believe I remember him reading a novel. But I do remember him reading non-fiction continuously, biographies, histories, geography accounts, we had a library of National Geographics, that sort of thing. Reader's Digest, abridged biographies, Reader's Digest, encyclopedias. So the house was filled with books. One useful thing I might say is that in South Africa, we didn't have television until 1976. And I suspect that might have had something to do with my love of reading, because we didn't have much else to do. I was 13 years old in 1976. By then, I was already reading prolifically, and history was a natural adjunct to that. It wasn't difficult to slip into an historical genre, if you like. Now, because of the age of my parents, um, my father grew up. We didn't have much experience of the Second World War in South Africa, other than, in other words, we were a combatant, but not in our country. Much like America. You were a combatant, but not the war, other than in Pearl Harbor, didn't take place in America. And so South Africa was very similar to that. Um, and so we had literally 500,000 soldiers fighting in the Desert War in the Eighth Army. Um, and so my parents knew people. My father was too young to have been in the war. My mother being a woman, she was older than my father by 3 years. So technically she could have been, had she been a man, she probably would have been. Um, but so, but they knew people. And what was interesting is that they knew both sides. My mother was German. Although born in Namibia, she wasn't associated in any way with Nazi Germany. In fact, her father was very disillusioned when he heard what was going on. In fact, he naturalized to become a South African because he was appalled at what he read about Nazi Germany's growth between 1933 and the rest. And so um, they knew people. When, after the war, people came back from the war. I knew people who were damaged, people who were wounded. One of our best friends was a well-known blind veteran, which got me, I must tell you, into another very interesting angle. Was I became fascinated by war and by war history, largely because of meeting these people. I met I met a man, more than one, but one in particular, who at the end of the war was found by the Americans as a 13-year-old boy with a submachine gun on his arm and an enormous German helmet that swamped his head. He could barely see. And so, the whole concept of child soldiers, something we don't think about. And in 1945, in March, April 1945 in Berlin, which was an incredibly vicious campaign, there's this youngster. And I got to know him very well, his parents he and his wife and his children. And I adored them. And he didn't have a vitriolic hatred of an enemy. He was very laconic about his experience. As you know, I used to ask him what he felt, what he thought of fighting, and the only word he could really come up with was hungry. And so this fascinated me. And then I met this blind veteran. Jimmy Ellis was his name. And he was associated with a very well-known, still exists today, although the name has changed, a very well-known blind veterans organization called St. Dunstan's. And St. Dunstan's had started in 1918, in fact in 1917 in England, and it was essentially a rehabilitation center for blind soldiers. And then by the Second World War, it was a very well-established organization. Of course, there was a brand new war and tons of people were blinded. It's actually quite interesting from a history point of view. It's quite interesting to see the difference because the nature of war changed. Sorry, I know I'm jumping all over the place, but it's quite an interesting segue, this. So in the First World War, in Britain alone, there were about 3,500 totally blinded veterans who came through the First World War. Many became blind later because of the gas. By the Second World War, there were only 1,800 blind United Kingdom veterans. Now, what that demonstrates is the change in war. First of all, no chemical warfare for a start. But it just shows you that as much of a vicious war, there were less blinded people. And I'll come back to that point because it's actually quite an interesting historical issue. So anyway, after the war, this man, Jimmy Ellis, who was a British man, blinded during the Desert War, the Britons sent all their many of their, not just blind, but other wounded soldiers to South Africa, because South Africa was a British dominion. And they sent them through the Suez Canal, down the east coast of Africa, and they disembarked at Durban, our easternmost city, or in Cape Town, which is where I live, which is the southernmost city. and southwesternmost city. And both in Durban and in Cape, but in Cape Town, there was a rehabilitation center called Tembani. And this man, Jimmy Ellis, became one of their rehabilitation patients. But he was a very dynamic man, extremely funny. He could have been a stand-up comic. He had been a very useful boxer in his day. He had been a very good piano player, and he was seriously wounded. He had great, I couldn't see them, but he had terrible, what's that? Shrapnel scars on his face. And he had blown out both his eyes. He had picked up what you would now call an unidentified explosive device, an IED. He had picked up one of those and it blew up in his hand, and of course it blew his hand off. So as a young boy, you can imagine the macabre fascination of this very funny, very personable man with only one hand and a hook on the other and blind. And I grew up literally at this man's knee because he was one of our best friends. And so that gave me an interest in military history. And years later, and I must tell you that the reason why we got to know him was because my grandmother was by then running St. Dunstan's in South Africa. And she was the general manager of St. Dunstan's. And so we got to meet many blind veterans, not just blind from the Second World War, blind from the Korean War, we had a border war here for many years in the 70s and 80s. The border of Angola and Namibia, we fought a war. And many soldiers came back blind and wounded. And so we got to meet them because my grandmother ran this organization, and she was a very social woman, and she encouraged these blind veterans to come to her home for drinks. And so I was very exposed to that. So that gave me quite an interest. And I must tell you, my grandmother died. She ran the place until 1985, retired, and she died 3 years later. So that was 1988. In 2003, St. Dunstan, South Africa, asked me, because by then I was quite a well-known blind entrepreneur, and I was a consultant, and I was well-known, and so I was asked to sit on the board of St. Dunstan's, and I still do. And so I got exposed to the modern St. Dunstan's, the border war blinded guys, some of the old Second World War guys, a few of them live still, but then they all died. But then we had an interesting experience because there was a joint exercise, if you like, a collaborative association between the American Blind Veteran Association and in the UK, blind veterans used to be called St. Dunstan's. They now changed their name to blind veterans, and our St. Dunstan's. And we used to get together. And we got together in London, and we got together in South Africa. And I was privileged enough to fly up to the UK, and I met with the American blind veterans, and I met obviously with the UK, and we stayed at the incredibly elaborate blind rehabilitation centre belonging to the United Kingdom Blind Veteran Association. And it was a great privilege. And this is where I told you I'd get back to something. And my interest in war history sparked something here. And I was curious that, remember I said the First World War, 3,500 were blinded, Second World War, 1,800. This is just in the UK soldiers. What was interesting was that both Britain and America have fought a 24-year war in Afghanistan and Iraq. Okay, not quite 24 years because they've got out of Afghanistan now, largely, and Iraq. But the point is, at the time of asking, that war was about 15, 16, 17 years old. Much longer than either the First World War, in fact, longer than the First World War and the Second World War combined. And there were literally only a couple of hundred blind veterans from those two wars, which is quite an interesting issue. Just think about it. And what it is, it's a commentary on the changing nature of war. Well, warfare is different now. There's a lot more distance warfare, drones, that sort of thing. Also, the advance of protective armor is something they never had in the First World War and the Second World War. The only armor you had on your person was a helmet, and that wasn't much use. Now there is incredible Kevlar armor that the soldiers wear. The helmets are much more elaborate. There's face guards. And so explosions which might have blinded people in the Second World War and First World War now don't actually blind soldiers as much because of their very sophisticated helmets, gear, and armor. And so soldiers are being blinded now less from blunt trauma or gross trauma, like an explosive thing or a sniper shot. That will still happen. But what they're being blinded from now is percussion injuries, which damage the brain, and particularly the part of the brain which governs the optic nerve. And so that's an interesting situation. Anyway, so back to this man that I met, and so it really spurred my interest to read. And so my first history book that I read about war was the story of Douglas Bader, who happened to be the double amputee war ace. He was a bit of an ace, although he was shot down quite early. In the Second World War, he was a British RAF pilot, and he was captured fairly early, but he was a useful pilot. And of course, the fact that he was a double amputee really sparked my interest. I wasn't particularly interested in disability in those days. I hadn't really made the connection between my blindness and other people's disabilities. I really hadn't thought that through. But obviously, this is something of a hero thing going on here with this man. And so his book was called, it wasn't written by him, it was written by a man called Paul Brickhill. And it's called A Reach for the Sky. And it was aimed at youngsters. It was aimed at teenagers. In fact, it was a set work book when I was at school. And so that was my first war history. And my second, interestingly, was a book about the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, 2, I think. And it was written by the Japanese side. It was written by a Japanese captain of a ship at Midway. Sorry, I lied. The book was about Midway, not Pearl Harbor. But it obviously began with Pearl Harbor. But it was so interesting to read it from a Japanese perspective. And so I started getting quite interested in reflective history reading where you can see both sides. I don't do it all the time. And I haven't had the luxury of always finding. And this is the trouble with blind readers, is that we are very often, as I grew older and my vision grew less, I was less and less able to read what I wanted to read. I didn't do Braille because I hadn't gone to a school for the blind. So I was very much captured in what I read. I had to read what I found. And then I joined, South Africa has a very sophisticated tape aids for the blind library, which is also the Braille library. And it's very old. It's 100 years old. And so I joined Tape Aids for the Blind, and there I found a very rich source of material to read. So I was now in university, and I was able to read more. But still, you can't always read what you want to read. You can only read what they have available. And now that's always frustrated me. To this day, it frustrates me. There are many things, particularly in history, which you can't find in an accessible format. And I find that very sad, actually. But it did start me on, so I was by now well entrenched. And so I didn't bother with novels as much. So I wasn't hooked on novels at all, really, because there was just so much really exciting. I mean, there's nothing more exciting than war history that's written well. That got me onto biographies because, you read a character, like Admiral Cunningham, who had, if you read about Admiral Cunningham, who was the admiral of the fleet during the Second World War, for the British. I mean, his story reads like Nelson. In fact, he's regarded as a modern Nelson. Um, so I had read his biography, and you don't need to read fiction when you read a well-written biography or autobiography. There is so much out there which is captivating, and if you have a very vivid imagination like I did, probably helped by my parents' storytelling and my ability to have enjoyed those classic comics, these things come alive. So when I read a story, a biography, when Teddy Roosevelt was shot, I forget it was 1912 or 1914, I forget, and he was campaigning. He wanted to be president again. He'd already had a term and a bit. He took over from McKinley when McKinley was dead, was assassinated in September 1901. And so Teddy, finished McKinley's term and then went on for a second term. That's great. And then Taft joined, and then Taft came in, and then Teddy wanted to run again. And Teddy has the most extraordinary history. The what does he call himself? The wild, I forget the name. But he was quite wild, and he it was wonderful stuff what he had been through in Cuba, um, for instance. Um, and he was a tough guy, and he boxed, and he was a great hunter, and he was an incredibly thoughtful person. Actually, the reason why America has the number of game reserves and natural conservatories, reserves, is entirely 100% because of Teddy Roosevelt. And so his sort of biography reads like a novel. When he was shot, how incredibly, it was tragic, but he didn't die, and he, relatively slightly, he was significantly wounded, and all this has come up for me when Trump the other day, had a near miss in that assassination attempt. I immediately thought of Teddy, because
Right. So
Teddy was also on it.
Jeremy, just
Yeah,
want to step in here for a couple things.
yeah,
Nothing personal about you. Just for my own sanity and personal security. Uh, please. I don't mean to sound harsh.
I know where you're
If
going. I'm not going to say anything about it.
please don't just for right now, things are a little tense in our country. Please don't mention President Trump at the moment, okay? Just to be,
With
because
pleasure.
people are watching this, and you don't want to say
Abs-
anything about that right now. But
Okay,
what
no
I
problem.
wanted to say, thank you. But what I wanted to say was and I was waiting for a time to interject because I want to make sure that our audience, I wanted to make sure that our audience can ask you a history question, because, and then we'll talk for another half hour about history, and then we'll transition, because I know that they do. Latabo from South Africa, and of course Preston, have questions. But before I do open their microphones, your story just resonates so well with me. That this is exactly how I grew up, and in the States. And yes, we in high school we learn about the Boer Wars. In Boer, the Dutch word for the Netherlands word for farmer in Dutch. Yes,
That's right. That's
the
right.
War of the Farmers. Yes, we American people sort of know what you were talking about, but American people are only a little bit. We vaguely know about these things, but not nearly as much as you do, and you really know. So so how many history classes do you teach in your local university? Because I think you're overly qualified.
Not one.
I gotta say.
Not
Um,
one.
that's very funny. But the overarching thing that you said that really resonated with me is you developed an eclectic, which is how I am. I'm definitely eclectic, and you developed an eclectic interest in the military, and actually, so do I, and so did I. And I
Mm,
think that a lot of blind people, although it pains me to tell you that even in America, I cannot be in the army, which has given me in my lifetime a great deal of confusion and sadness.
yeah,
But that's life. I actually think that a lot of blind people are fascinated by soldiers simply because of two main reasons. Soldiers come together, they accept each other, and they fight superhuman accomplishments. So I
Yeah.
think that's very attractive to someone with
Mm.
a disability. Which is why I always think it's strange how in America I can't be in the military, which I always think is strange because there are, and you can stretch your imagination to know what groups of people I'm talking about, but there are minorities who are minorities in America who can be in the army, and then blind people can't be. So I always think that's an irony. But the logical answer is, in a free country, things are not always perfect. Which is the sacrifice that we make to live in a free country, that there are always things you can do and always things you cannot do.
Sure, sure.
So that's just how that is. Um, but no, I mean, I was very familiar with the fact that the Germans colonized Namibia, which is why I knew that Namibia is the only country on the continent of Africa where everyone speaks German for that very reason. Wasn't specifically familiar with the history, but now I know it. And I'm not at all surprised about all of that. I think that a great percentage of the German population, certainly from Germany, was highly against World War II, having nothing to do with the Nazis for a moment. But certainly everybody was so exhausted from World War One and the Roaring Twenties, and then the Depression of the 30s,
Sure.
and the
Absolutely.
Franco of Spain and the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s ish. I think everybody at this point was so pissed off that I don't necessarily think that many German people wanted a conflict in 1939 when Hitler
I'm sure they didn't.
invades Poland.
I'm sure they did.
I think the answer is it was only the monsters at the top of the ladder wanted it, and everybody else
Yeah.
suffered. Is the
Yeah.
answer,
Well, that's,
and
yeah. And I think,
more or less everybody suffered. Yes, go ahead. Hmm.
sure. Oh, yeah, completely.
Yeah,
Completely.
yeah.
I mean, I only grew interested in the Civil War because I read Hemingway's For
Hmm.
Whom the Bell
For whom the
Tolls.
bell tolls,
It's
right? And
what a
where
wonderful,
Hemingway, now
actually, I
Hemingway,
think
and
it's his
Hemingway
finest
was
book
a right, yeah, yeah, and Hemingway was an ambulance driver, I
in the
believe, and I
First World
think
War. Yeah.
yes, indeed. Now, and this sounds silly. Hemingway though was I forget. Hemingway was in the British Army, was a Royal Army, right? Or was he an
No, no,
American?
no. He went as a volunteer, so he might have gone before 1917. Thinking about it now, I actually don't tell you. I don't know the honest truth, but I have a feeling he might have been early. He certainly regarded himself as one of the first Americans to ever have been
Oh, so
wounded. He didn't
Hemingway
last
was an
long,
American. Okay, Hemingway was American. I had forgotten
he
that. I
was
wasn't sure if he was
American,
American or
but
British. Okay,
he might have gone as a volunteer, as a neutral volunteer, they called him. And there was
right.
a whole bunch of Americans came over earlier than 1917 and fought.
Mm,
Um, but it was a little bit unofficial, and so they were supernumeraries for the Allies, which were obviously at that time mostly the English and the French.
right, right.
But yeah,
Absolutely.
but anyway, that's beside the point.
Yeah, very, very good. So nowadays in South Africa, moving the history clock forward to today. So, every country has their own way of teaching history to children. So in the South African school systems, South Africa clearly has a rich history. What history is learned in South Africa for children?
That's a very good question. So I must tell you, okay, so there's a very important context to understand here. Because of our racial segregation history, um, we, every country's history is somewhat, what's the word, edited. There's an old saying,
Absolutely.
until such time that the lions can write, history will always be told on the part of the hunter. And
Hmm.
so every history is written with a bias. And so in South Africa, our history was very dominated by colonial history. And, we have a colonial history from before 1652, but largely from 1652, and the Dutch came and 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 then the British came in 1806. And what we never were taught as children was anything, or not a hell of a lot, about the black history, which of course were the indigenous people. Um, and so, we had a very, very, very scant historical glance at the indigenous people in the very southern Cape, where Cape Town is. Um, who were called the Khoi and the San. We knew very little, just a little bit. They just teased us a bit with some stuff, much of it wrong, by the way. And then there was incorrect history taught about the African migration down Africa. And they colored over, or they brushed over much of the inconvenient truths about Black history um, in this country, and they would sometimes talk quite a lot about the colonial victorious history and not pay enough attention towards the serious damage done to the Africans and other indigenous or local communities damaged by colonialism. Now, this podcast isn't about judging one or the other. I'm talking about history here. And I get very sad when people want to redress history. So the taking away of statuary which depict soldiers or generals from a war, to me is a sad thing. Changing names, because what you're trying to do is erase history, and that's terrible.
Yeah,
You need to
yeah.
see history, warts
For
and all.
for what it is.
So
Absolutely. And I think that
so
gives us a very good moment here because I want input from the audience here.
please,
Let's go over to South Africa and let's go talk to, of course, let me open the tray here. Let's
you
talk.
said Latolo, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Okay, definitely. All right, let's open the phone lines here to Latabo, who is in Pretoria. And I'm sure that he has a question and a comment, and he definitely got a kick out of this. So let's see. All right, there he is. Go, Latabo. I know you have some comments to make and a question. You can ask a question, comment, and what do you think, man? And let's give him a moment to open his microphone. We're also joined also by Preston. I don't know, Jeremy, I don't know if you know much about Preston Gaylor, but he is a broadcaster like I am here in the States. He owns a podcast and a radio network, so he's also doing wonderful work for us all over the world. We're also going to open, we're going to, okay. And or either one. Okay, so Preston, either you or Latabo can ask a question, but I definitely want to give you guys a chance to ask one question. So go ahead. To either one of you. Uh,
Hello, hello there, Jeremy. It's awesome to meet you, and it's a good thing because I came back inside to get more coffee. We need a human hot one here today. So, but anyway, it's good to virtually meet you. Uh, my question for you actually, and you did a good part one. I actually caught that episode. I'm gonna have to replay it again because it was so good. But
oh, thank you.
my question for you, sir, is what has been like your biggest breakthrough uh, in your country between us here in the States and South Africa? So this may be a little
I
twist,
think
but
not at all,
it's
Preston. So
interesting.
let's kind of clarify that, Preston. That's incredible.
Clarify.
You're definitely on the right track. What do you mean by, because I just want to just trying to direct it so that we get the best results possible. By breakthrough, what do you mean, Preston, by breakthrough?
Pretty much what I'm looking at is mainly advancements or technological changes
Yeah, that's a really
or
good question. Okay, I think Jeremy understands. Go.
yeah, got it.
I'm afraid I'm not sure I fully understand. Are you saying what contribution has America had, which has benefited us in South Africa, like
Yes,
technological? Well, I
yeah,
suppose, one. I think, as much as Helen Keller is a slightly controversial subject matter, Helen Keller is strangely unpopular in the disability sector, which I've always found very strange. I
right.
understand it to a degree, but what you can't get away from is that, and beyond her politics or beyond the fact that she was a charity case in many ways, um, is that she demonstrated the ability to utilize resources. So her very, very prolific Braille reading, the fact that she used Annie, as her amanuensis is not the point. Um, she was an incredibly erudite woman. And because she was so extraordinarily well known all around the world, including here, my own father met her. Um, my
Incredible.
Wow.
grandmother, my grandmother
Incredible.
hosted her here in South Africa. because she ran that Blind Veterans Association. She was a big deal in the blind world, and so she hosted Helen Keller. So you see, when you now you mustn't get hooked on the negative drama around, oh, did she stand for the charity case and all that nonsense. It's not about that. It's about understanding that this woman was erudite. She was extraordinarily well read. She was an amazing writer. And because of her popularity, she, in many ways, opened many people's eyes to the possibilities of education. So I
Oh
get
yeah.
very frustrated when people it's a bit like political, discourse where you hook onto something negative. And what you do by that is you blind yourself to perspective. It's very important to look at things. I always say you need perspective. You've got to step back. I'm very capable of looking at a conflict, um, which might be controversial, and to try and make the case for both sides. And one needs to do that in life. And so that's one. Obviously, the fact that, another one would be Braille, but of course, Braille, that's French. What is interesting about Braille, I found, is that it took so long to actually adopt as a universal language or as a universal technique. It took years. Years. It was well into the 1900s before it was actually adopted as a universal thing. And of course, the Perkins
Yes.
Center did more than any other place, I suspect, in the world. I'm still cross with how much they charge for their Braille typewriters, by the way.
Oh yeah.
Not that
I
I do
know.
Braille, but I think, to use a 130-year-old design and to still charge the kind of money they do, I think is iniquitous. But that's another story.
Right. Yeah, I fully agree. I mean, I've owned, well, actually, matter of fact, here in my uh place of place of coming to you right now, I do own a Perkins still. I still use it as backup for all my Braille projects and things. And I actually read Louis Braille's autobiography when I was younger, and I did read Miss Keller's book as well. So we all have definitely come a long way, but I feel that there's definitely more need to be done on
Yeah.
all aspects.
She wrote about 20 books, Preston. And if you
Right.
want to read a really clever book, I read it just the other day. Do you know the blind academic Georgina Cleage?
I
No.
think I heard of her.
Ah, brilliant, brilliant. She's wonderful. She's a artist. She's an incredible writer. She teaches English. She's an academic. She teaches English at college level. She's retired now, although I doubt it very much that she will retire. But she wrote one of the finest commentaries on Helen Keller, which is one of the reasons why I have an
Hmm.
opinion, is because of what she wrote. It's called Blind Rage, Letters to Helen Keller. And it's probably the finest commentary on biography. And it's so clever. It'll rate as one of the finest books I've read because it's so clever. Um, and so, yeah, oh man, don't get me started. South Africa only recently got associated with Bookshare. Quite literally, only in 2020 did we, in fact, get Bookshare in South Africa for no charge, where I now can go on to Bookshare. However, because South Africa hasn't signed the Marrakesh Treaty yet, and it's very frustrating because we were right there during the whole negotiations of Marrakesh and the WIPO Treaty. We had delegates there from the very beginning. We have still not signed it. As a result, we're not part of the WIPO Treaty, which means we can't get full access to Bookshare. So I only have access to about a third of what you do at Bookshare.
So I have a question, by the way. So that Georgina woman you
Yeah,
mentioned, so
yeah.
is so you probably can anticipate what's in the back corner of my brain. So is she still with us? Is she still alive, that person?
Yeah, yeah, apparently.
And
Um,
do
I think
you
she's,
do
you know
you
what? I
do you
can't
know her?
remember. No, I don't, but I know
Ah,
people who do. I have
ah.
a blind academic friend, two blind academic friends. That one is a professor of psychology at a university here in Cape Town, and the other is a postdoc researcher at the same university. And they both know her because they've participated in And that's what COVID did for us, of course, was
Yeah.
it brought the
Well,
world together through
we'll certainly
Zoom, right?
talk. Well, after today, Jeremy, we'll certainly talk about getting those two friends of yours to come to Aaron's Opinion. I would love to interview those people. Obviously, they're
Yeah,
so
with
welcome here.
pleasure.
And obviously, you can see where I'm going to stretch my brain and stretch the magic. Obviously, I'm going to ask them, hey, what do you think about getting this Georgina person to come? Because getting to have an intellectual conversation about a character like Helen Keller, who is so much mysticism and so much mystery and so much right and so much wrong and ups and downs and in betweens. Boy, oh
Mm.
boy, oh boy, that would be a great listen. And I promise you, that would be a stunning accomplishment for anyone to get to talk about that topic in depth. And that would be
Well,
so,
I
so
intend
stunning.
to I want to reach out to her because in our next session we're going to be talking on audio description, and she's
Yeah,
written quite a lot about that. And
definitely.
I want to in fact reach out to her. So I need
I
to
know
ask
that
my
I know that you
friends.
will. I know that you will. You'll stretch and give her a reach and say, "Hey, there's this nice man named Aaron's Opinion, and he wants to learn from you." And
Yep. I'll do
yeah,
that.
I can anticipate that. Listen, my God, that would be it. I'm not like I don't know how many other podcasters have covered this topic in the world, so that would be an incredible listen. Um, anyway, back to you, Latabo. Though, Latabo, do you want to open your microphone, man? Is your headset plugged in over there, man? Because I know that you have a question. Um, I don't know why you didn't say anything. I don't know. Um,
Maybe ask him to put it in the chat. Oh, there we go.
yeah.
Hmm. Oh, it's a pity.
Excuse me.
Oh, he's using his cell phone.
Oh, he is.
Yeah, I've just
Excuse me.
read the chat.
Uh, okay. Okay. No matter. No matter. One second. Hold on. Okay. So yeah. So anyway, as far as all this history stuff goes, this is absolutely amazing. So let's see. All right. We have another in part one here of history today. We have another 13 minutes. So Jeremy, let's turn the microphone in the other direction. What
Yeah.
are some active history questions that you want to learn about me, about the United States, about my perspective on the world? What do you really want to know? Dig under my skin right away and let's really get this going. What do you really want to know?
Well, I'm interested in what is your historical bent? Is there a particular genre which you're
First of all,
interested in?
it's endearing that you already assume that I will present to you a biased history with a bent. I don't do bents. I just have history. That was clever. No, my history doesn't have a slant. The only slant that my history has is that everything I say is true, even all my opinions. But that's why it's history. So
Yeah.
my history dates back definitely to Eastern Europe. As I've told you, I'm a Jewish guy. So my history
Yeah, you
dates
didn't
back.
actually tell me that. I didn't
Well,
realize
now
that.
you know. Now you know.
Great,
So
great.
I descend from, and proud of it, I descend from Polish Jews.
Okay.
And so because of that, I have a deep knowledge of the history of World War II, and World War One. You mentioned the gas that people would be blinded with in ancient times during the First World War. My great grandfather fought
Hmm.
in that war too in the 101st F Company Engineers. And it's very special, but in our office, I still have his box, and inside his box, I still have his buttons that he wore on his post. He was a postman after the war, and I
Oh.
still have his buttons that he wore on his uniform in the 1920s and 30s. And I still have a tiny little pocket Bible in a tiny little box, and it's written
Wow.
in Quebecois French, and we can
Huh.
still read it, and it's still legible, and the pages are gold. And so, let me tell you that I have some historical relics, and I deeply appreciate history just as much as you. And I
Mm.
think that when you really, put it all together to understand, American people, like I was saying before in this other part a little earlier today, American people sort of have heard of the Boer War. They've sort of heard of it, but if you ask them, so what does Boer mean? Like, who are the
Can,
people? They wouldn't be able to tell you. And so,
I'd love to
yeah,
give you a quick snapshot if you like, because it's a
yeah,
war with a difference. May I
yeah.
do that quickly?
You
I'll
may
give you
certainly give a snapshot. Absolutely.
the
Yes.
quick skinny. So it's once again, it's because history tends to become revisionist when there are changes in a country, and our country's gone through a change from a colonial and then a sort of regime, a rather not quite fascist, but certainly a very a nationalist regime, followed by what we have now, which is a country open for all, for freedom, a one man, one vote kind of thing. Anyway, so the Boer War is looked at with a jaundiced eye by people of color, black people in this country, but because it was so badly taught. I had the privilege, and I'll talk about it in our next session, of doing. I'm doing it at the moment, so it hasn't been released yet. But we're doing an audio description of the Boer War Museum right here in Bloemfontein, where I'm sitting, where I happen to be doing other work. Anyway, so the war, a couple of outcomes of the war are really frightening. Firstly, it's the first time where we saw the use of what's called concentration camps. These were not meant for the combatants. These were not prisoner of war camps. These were for the women and children. So the British burned the farms, and they burned 8,000 farms. And as a what do they call that? Slash and burn. There's another term for it, I forgot. Where if you burn the people out and you can't, so they can't eat. The Boer soldiers, were hemmed into certain areas and were literally herded like cattle, and many of them captured near the end. So the point is, the farms were burned, and the women and children were taken to the concentration camps. And the upshot was that 26,000 women and children died in those camps during that short war. It was only from June 1900 on to early 1902. Now, the combatants went anywhere but South Africa. There were camps in St. Helena, there were camps in India, camps in then Ceylon, which of course is now Sri Lanka, and there were even camps in Bermuda. And the soldiers and they were treated much better. They were better fed, they were better housed, but the women were terribly treated. Now, here's the bit that's never been taught. And I've just learned it now. I'm 61 years old, and I've only just realized how bad it was, is that no one was ever taught about the lot of the black South Africans affected by that war. So there's two sides to it. On the one hand, the Boer soldiers had retainers who had been associated with their farms. They were staff from their farms. They were employees, and they were often very loyal. And they were literally retainers, and they fought alongside the Boers, not so much in a combatant situation, although I suspect they often enough was combatant, but it was unofficial. But largely, in a support idea. Many of them would have been captured too, and I've yet to discover what happened to them, by the way. Then there were the women and children associated with those retainers. So when the farm is burned and the white owner of the farm and child were taken into a disgusting concentration camp, which was riddled with disease,
Right.
the black women were taken into even worse camps. And so when there's 26,000 white women and children dying in that war, and there were over 26, 7, 8, no one knows the proper number of black women and children dying in even worse camps. You can't even imagine the camp. Picture Andersonville. If you know your Civil War history, you'll know about Andersonville. And what made Andersonville so really savage and disgusting was that there was almost no shelter provided. So you got a camp a mile in perimeter, and no shelter was provided. They had to find their own shelter. That's why so many men died. Now those camps were very much like the black concentration camps that the women and children were forced into. Now, what's interesting about this is one of the situations which you never understand. So if you add the 26,000 and the 28 odd thousand women and children who died, so that's now over 50,000 deaths. Only 4,000 Boers died,
Yeah.
and 20,000 British died, mostly from disease, by the way. So that's where the civilians died in greater numbers, by double, in fact, and more than the actual combatants. I mean, how interesting is that?
Very, extremely, and it's all information that I will certainly learn about. Most people have never heard this level of history, of this level of historical knowledge. I got to tell you, your knowledge of history is just stellar. I mean, I kind of forgot how many books have you published about history again? How many books have you secretly written?
Not a one.
Not a well, maybe you should because maybe you want to write these things down and maybe you want to do your own little journal sometime because people deserve the truth that you have given them, you see?
Well,
So maybe you
Aaron,
should consider that. Yeah.
I don't, in the words of Paul McCartney, who said,
Well,
"I'm a
what
lover,
about
not a
in well, what
fighter.
about in Jeremy Opperman's
I'm a reader,
words?
not a writer." um, uh, but you know what? What you're doing now, and this, I've got quite interested in doing podcasting. Simply, not so much. I not necessarily want to do it myself, but storytelling doesn't have to be written,
Right.
and you're
That's
proving
true.
that. And so
That's
this
true. This
sort of
is
thing,
an
I
incredible,
would
an
do this
incredible
all
thing.
day because
This is
I'm
an
a
incredible
storyteller.
thing. Certainly, it's incredible because we are creating together. We're all creating a permanent record of this knowledge for sure that will be listened to forever. So this never goes away. All this knowledge, absolutely. But so very very wonderful. I do want to yeah, I do want to stay with the times here as we say. All right, 4 minutes on the segment here. I'm going to give you one more question. I'm going to say, so Jeremy, if you can ask me one question about American history, one more question, and then we'll wrap it up for history. What do you want to know?
Um, Wow. I mean, American history happens to be probably my favorite history. So I've read a great deal of American history. Um, so I know quite a lot about American history. I'm not saying I know it all by any means. I'm really not. So when did your people come to America
Great.
from Poland?
My people, so the Jewish people that I descend from, we believe that they came obviously before the war. So anywhere from the years 1910 to 1930. It has been something that I've never been able to fully unearth. Obviously, you would not be
Mm,
surprised to know, and you would understand this,
mm,
that obviously documentation, which is why you should write things down and talk on podcasts, because documentation in
mm,
society in the 20th century certainly was not existent. Even in Eastern Europe, it was non-existent. Certainly in the continent of Africa, they didn't write anything down until the early 2000s. So there was a huge gap in documentation. Anyway, that's what I think. And those people would settle in Washington, D.C. And eventually, my mother would be born in Washington, D.C. And so would I eventually in the year 1991. Jeremy Opperman, fabulous segment on history. I got to tell you, I could not have possibly asked for anything better. That was a 10-star experience. That was a PhD history class right there. I think we'll have other PhD friends of yours looking up, just learning from that episode because all that knowledge you gave, I mean, someone could do a full research paper just on that. All right. So what we're going to do now is I'm actually gonna actually because you have done such a superior. But I got to tell you, you've done a superior job with staying on track and on time, and I tremendously appreciate it. Now, what I'm going to do is actually, let's see here. All right, we're going to turn off that. All right, I'm going to turn off my camera. I am actually going to say, all right, I'm going to stop here. So here's what I'm going to do before I do it. I'm going to actually stop this recording. I'm going to mute for just a second, get a drink of water, stretch my legs for just a moment, and then in just a couple minutes, like in 2 minutes, I'm going to come back. So we're going to take a little. Let's say we're going to take a little 3 to 5 minute pause, and then just don't change anything. Just stay right there, and then I'll be back in just a minute here. All right.
sure,
So
sure.
anyway,
Okay.
that was Aaron's opinion, part one, history with Jeremy Opperman. And all right, now I gotta okay. So yeah, so thank you so much, everybody. History, that was part one, history with Jeremy Opperman. Thank you so much, everybody, and help one person today, help 1 million people tomorrow.